Hopefully we'll both disappear so you're not. Okay, so it looks like we're live. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manchester in Translation. So this is a virtual conference for aspiring translators organised by Comma Press. So we are a short story publisher based in Manchester that also specialises in fiction in translation. So we're hoping this event will mark International Mother Language Day, which is coming up on the 21st of February, but it's also an opportunity to celebrate all things literary translation, which we're very, very keen to do. So this session is the very first of the conference, but there will be a number of different talks and panels over the next 2-3 days. So please make sure to check out commapress.co.uk and join us for as many as that you can. We're also on social medias as @commapress, so we tend to we'll be talking about the conference there as well. So to kick things off, we're incredibly lucky to have quite a prolific translator with us today. So Arunava Sinha, which you can see on your screen, who you can see on your screen now. So he's joining us from New Delhi, and we're hoping that he will help us to set the tone of the conference. So no pressure, Arunava, but also give us lots of insight into the life of a literary translator as well. So I'm going to quickly introduce Arunava before I hand over. So forgive me for reading quickly off my screen. So Arunava is the translator of over 60 books, that's both fiction and non-fiction, so from Bengali into English. His translations have won various prizes, including the Crossword Book Award and the Muse India Translation Award. He was shortlisted for the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize in 2010 and was also the recent recipient of a Pen Translates Award for the Yogini by Sangeeta Bandyopadhyay, published by Tilted Access in 2019. So Arunava is going to speak for about 45 minutes now, and then there will also be lots of time for Q&As at the end. So as we're talking, if anything springs to mind, just make sure to type it in the YouTube chat and we'll try and get through as much as possible in the short time that we have. So I'm going to disappear now and then hand over to Arunava, but thank you again for joining us. And yes, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Comma Press, and everybody else who's involved with setting up this conference, and welcome everyone. It's really wonderful not to have to be tied down to a time zone. So I'm in Delhi now in India, and it is about 4:30 in the afternoon. And while for some of you, it's probably about 11 in the morning, I hope there are others around the world in different countries. So I wanted to talk today about the uniqueness of being a translator who lives and works in India. And I want to talk specifically about the anxieties of being a translator in India. Now, I'm smiling as I use the word anxiety because it is not necessarily a bad thing. I believe that these anxieties actually help us do better at our work. But let me start first by explaining the landscape, as it were, in which these anxieties are rooted. So India is a very unique country in terms of language, because if you consider the position of the English language in India, it is a colonial legacy. It came to India, it was brought to India by first traders from the UK in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then it became the language in which the East India Company conducted its trade for near about 100 years, during the process of which the company also took over the administration of many parts. And then after about 100 years of their presence here as de facto rulers, the British government actually took over and made India part of the British Empire officially, which meant roughly about another 90 years of British culture, the English language being the lingua franca, as it were, for those who administered and those who performed administrative tasks. So this is the English that comes down to us in India today. And although it's been 70 years since India became independent of British rule, English has continued to proliferate and has remained perhaps arguably the most important language of power and influence in India. And this keeps growing. India is also home to many thousands of other languages. And when I say thousands, I'm probably putting in mildly. But there are at least a dozen languages in which there are flourishing literatures. So you could actually compare India to Europe in a sense. There are flourishing literatures whose origins go back to periods much older than the time that English literature um, began to be read and then began to be written as well in India. So these are much older literatures, and while it is possible technically to use a term called Indian literature, the fact is that there's no such thing really. India is a landmass with a number of different literatures, each in a different language, and as is inevitable, each language comes with its own set of cultural tools, references, structures, and traditions. So, and very often these are not even comparable. So we live in this. However, because India is a country politically, what has happened here is that we are a market. Every geography is a market now. And because we are a market, publishing companies work across every region of India in this market. And therefore, English language publishing is big in India. It's probably the single largest language as far as publishing, even of trade books, is concerned. I'm not even taking textbooks into account here, but even as trade books go, it is the largest publishing industry. So India is in this unique state where you have more than a dozen languages being read in the form of literature across the country at different points of time. And the same people very often read at least in two languages, if not three. It is quite common for a person to be reading both in English as well as in what we call mother tongue. And that's what 21st February or 21 February is all about, Mother Tongue Day. For those of you who don't know the history, I'll segue quickly into what happened. It was in 1947, as you may know, the original Indian landmass was partitioned at the time of independence from the British into two countries, India, and then there was a new country named Pakistan, which existed in two masses, two fragments, as it were, one to the west of India and one to the east of India, called West Pakistan and East Pakistan, respectively. But they had different languages. And because what was East Pakistan was carved out of the province of Bengal, the language of East Pakistan was Bangla, or Bengali as it's called in English, which is my mother tongue as well. And the primary languages of West Pakistan were Punjabi, Sindhi, and Urdu. And Urdu became the state language. So the Bengalis in the the eastern segment of Pakistan did not want Urdu imposed on them, on their daily lives, on their administration, and so on, and they protested. And there was this led to violence, and there was a violent uprising over the use of language early in the 1950s, as very soon after independence. And that was when university students were killed. And because this took place on the 21st of February, subsequently, after East Pakistan wrested its independence from West Pakistan on the strength of its language movement, 21st February became known as International Mother Language Day. So Bangladesh, as the country is now called, is, as you can see, it contains the word Bangla, and possibly, I'm not 100% sure, but possibly it's the only one of the very few countries, if not the only country in the world, which is named for its language. Of course, there's also a joke that the word Bangla also applies to the country liquor that is distilled outside of the corporate distilleries. And so we are, in a sense, a language which is also named after its favorite drink, or vice versa, but that's another matter. Anyway, so in the presence of all these languages, what role does translation play? Now, this is where it all gets very interesting. Because there is no, although there are, as I said, there are some people who read in two languages, and India is a very vast country, 1.3 billion people and counting, 60% of whom are under 30. So there aren't too many people who can actually read in more than two languages, which means that to the majority of the people, the literatures that are not originally written in English or not in their own mother tongue are closed. And effectively, you have these islands that cannot really be reached because of a lack of language. So English became the natural choice of translated literature for this very reason, because English stretches all over the country. People all over the country read it. So for the past, 20, 30, or 40 years now, English has become the de facto language of translation of the literatures of India. This is a very unique situation, because in no country in the world do you have its own languages being translated into English for a readership in that same country, right? Normally, you would get translations from languages of other countries so that people of your own country can read it, or you would be translating into the languages of other countries. But in India, we have this situation where, at least, as I said, a dozen languages, books from a dozen languages are translated into a language that is now very much part of the Indian fabric, which is English. So this makes translating into English in India a very unique activity compared to anywhere else in the world, because your readers are right there. They're your neighbors, they're your family, they're your friends, which would normally not be the case if you were translating into the language of another country altogether. So how does this lead to the anxieties that I was talking about? I'll start with perhaps the facetious one out of the three. This has to do with the fact that English language publishing is still centered in the West, as far as India is concerned, in the Western Hemisphere, right? Primarily in the UK and in the US as well. So just as those who write their works originally in English in India are very keen to be published in the Western publishing markets, so too are translators. And therefore, there is this one layer of anxiety. Am I going to, as a translator, am I going to be published where it really matters? Somehow there is this hierarchy that has been created, that being published in India is not good enough. You have to be published in the West. Now, this is not the fault of the West. The West, or publishing companies from the West, are not breathing down our necks and saying, we do not recognize your existence as translators unless one of us publishes you. But it is a notion that has persisted. It is a notion that has perhaps been handed down to us by our parents and our grandparents, where anything that has to do with the English language somehow seems to need the approval of, the UK in particular, in order for it to be considered world class. And this is not a feeling or notion that we have managed to shake off. Now, the reason for that could also be partly economic at this point, which is quite frankly that as a translator, if you were to be published in the UK or the US, very crudely, to put it very crudely, you'd be making a lot more money than you would in India. And I know that translators in the West don't exactly consider themselves well paid, but believe me, if what translators in the West are paid were to be converted into Indian currency, we would consider ourselves extremely well paid. We would even consider making a living off it. Yeah, I'm not kidding. I mean it. But that's not the most serious thing. The real anxieties, and there are two of them, come from the fact that translators in India are also unique in another sense, which is that most translators around the world, not all, but most, tend to translate into their mother tongue. So they translate into the language that they have grown up reading and speaking and writing in. And they translate from a language which they may have learned, they may have acquired by virtue of living abroad, or in a number of, or picked up in a number of different ways. But the fact remains that their lives, for the most part, not this is not a generalization, of course, but their lives, for the most part, would have been led in the English language. Now, what does this mean? This has two implications for us translators here. One, we are translating into a language, therefore, and this is our second anxiety. I'll come to the first later. We are translating into a language, therefore, that we do not quite or cannot quite call our own. This, despite the fact that we spend much of our lives in this language. We spend much of our lives reading in it, writing in it, conversing in it. And yet, in some strange way, we cannot consider it the language with which we were born, because the truth is, for the majority of Indians, it is not the language with which we are born. It is not the language which we heard as babies. It is not the language our parents spoke to us. It is not the language their parents spoke to them when they grew up. And in some fashion, your identity is not built around the English language, however much it is the currency of social, intellectual, political, and all other kinds of discourse. So this leads to a situation where there is always this uncertainty about whether we are doing a good enough job in the English language. Now, this uncertainty is further multiplied when we make, and this is where I come back to the first point that I'd made, when we consider readers in the West our ideal target readers, because that's when we start worrying: are we writing the kind of English that a reader in the UK or in the US will enjoy, will understand, will be able to appreciate in all its richness? And this multiplies. It gets to a point sometimes where you start questioning every translation decision that you're taking, because you always wonder, I'm naturally translating it into a form of English that I am familiar with, that my social circles are familiar with. But what if it is that dreaded thing called, quote, Indian English, unquote? And sometimes you can't draw the line. In English in India has developed and has come to us now, and comes to us now from multiple sources, right? It comes to us from the books we read, it comes to us from social media, it comes to us from television, and now from streaming platforms. So we are being exposed to English as it is spoken in not only in the UK, but also in different parts of the US, or the English that is used by the entertainment industry in the US to represent the language of the characters that it portrays. So we have a situation now where we have this uh, this strange palette of English language that we unconsciously absorb and reproduce, and we are not entirely sure where it belongs. We know it does not belong in the UK. We know it does not belong in the US. We know it belongs in India in the sense of having been assimilated and put together here. But we also know that it does not really belong here, because this is not where it originated. These are not words and expressions that came to us naturally. And then, of course, there's a fourth component. The fourth component is actually the kind of usage of the English language that is unique to India, where the words may belong to any dictionary that you may pick up, but you will find them being used in a way that has nothing to do with their dictionary meaning. And these words have often been absorbed into Indian languages. I mean, I'm going to take a minute here to indulge myself and you to tell you about some English expressions that have come into the Bengali language, but which absolutely have nothing to do with their original meaning. For instance, a bus stop in Calcutta continues to be referred to as a stoppage. So my stoppage is here, I need to get off. And it is said completely unironically and unself-consciously. Um, One standard expression that our parents used quite a lot, and which we used to hear as children and would know that something was afoot at home and things were not going to be okay, was don't sin create for nothing. Don't create a scene for no good reason. But sin create and it's sin not seen became a phrase which, even if the individual words in the dim distant past originated in the English language, was a Bengali word for all intents and purposes, as was for nothing, completely a Bengali word. And there are many such examples. So we are confronted by this strange smorgasbord of offerings from the English language, out of which we have to often walk on eggshells to be able to come up with an idiom that will, on the one hand, be not only intelligible, but also acceptable to our mythical readership in India and in the West, but also, and this brings me to my most important point, but also to justice to the text which we are translating. And this is where the other problem lies for us, which is that having grown up in the language from which we are translating, we are very often very, very deeply, keenly aware of all the nuances and all the cultural references that the use of a word or a phrase may contain. And because we know it so well, we are very, very worried that we will not be able to translate it. That even if we do our best, there is no way that we can take that entire wealth of associations all the richness across into any other language. It would be a problem in any Indian language, but even more so multiplied when it goes into English. And then furthermore, when it goes to an audience, to a readership that is not familiar with I use the word culture with apologies, that is not familiar with the culture, the cultural setting of the text, we are not going to be able to offer any form of fidelity at all, most of all artistic fidelity. And this is an anxiety that we cannot quite overcome. We know that we are doing our best. We are sometimes even doing our heroic best, if I may put it that way. But because we are so keenly aware of the space in which the text has been written, we are beset by the notion that no, I have not succeeded in taking this across. Now, I cannot speak for translators who work from languages that are not their own in the sense, say, Bangla is my own. But I have a feeling perhaps that the worry might be a little lower, but I could be completely wrong. And I'm sure this level of anxiety and worry also has to do with the cultural distance between the countries or the regions from where the text originates and the one and where it is being read in translation. I dare say that texts perhaps from Europe would have more cultural affinity for readers in the UK, text from Korea or Japan or China, less so possibly. But also, if you look at English education in these countries, let's say a Korea or a Japan, it is probably, I'm not sure, I've not experienced this firsthand, but I have a feeling that English is not really considered the first language or the most important language in those countries. Their own languages, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese are. So English is an additional language which is used for various convenience and various purposes. So English is learned the same way. Here in India, however, English is learned in a way that is important for us to be able to get going in life. It is the currency of personal improvement. So we also learn English differently. We learn English from the legacies left by our colonial rulers in our schools and our colleges, and those legacies persist 70 years later. We also learn English from all the English language texts around the world that we read, and we read them voraciously. Um, English publishing in India actually is 70 to 80% dependent on imported books. So the local publishing is actually comprises only about 20% of it. So because our English reading sensibilities are shaped by all the English language literatures of the world, including, very importantly, including translations into English, we are caught in that situation where we know that the stars are not really so distant that we can never reach them. We know that the stars can be reached. We know that these are planets that others have occupied before us, and we are desperate to go there. So it is in this situation that many of us today find ourselves, the community of translators in India. And it's an interesting situation to be in. I don't see it as an impediment. I see it actually as a way of exploring more, of investigating more, and of finding ways to do more interesting work. And eventually, I hope that translators from India and translations into the English language of the literatures from India will get to a point where the English into which it is rendered can speak for itself unapologetically and without fear. And it strikes me that we are quite willing to read various flavors of English. All those of you who are in the UK were happy enough to read Indian English when Salman Rushdie wrote it. We read Caribbean English with great pleasure. We even read English that comes out of the African countries when the authors choose to write in English with great joy. We do not complain about the fact they don't read like they're not written in our backyard. Why is it then that we as translators have to make the reader feel that they're reading something that was written next door? Almost 100 years ago, or maybe 100 years ago, Walter Benjamin actually wrote in as many words, well, not in as many words because there's a translation and a paraphrase of a translation, that when you are translating into German, let your Hindi not become German, let your German become Hindi. And it struck me that is exactly what we are trying not to do. When we translate, we are trying not to let our Bengali, our Hindi, our Tamil, our Malayalam, our Kannada, our Telugu, our Gujarati, our Kashmiri, and now you have a sense of just how many languages we have. I haven't even mentioned all of them. We are not, we are trying to ensure that they become English. We are not trying to lend to the English language, at least for the duration of that novel, the richness that the language from which we are translating can provide, the the words, the sensations, the colors, the emotions even that can go in there. No, we are trying very hard to be easily accessible and easily understandable to our readers in the West. And this is perhaps where the crux of the matter lies, which brings me back to point one, which is this anxiety to be published and revered and given awards and grants and so on by publishers and arts organizations in the West. It's important. It's important to be part of this ecology. It is important that translations from India are available and read by readers in the West. But how important is it to play according to the rules as they exist now? If the literatures of India are so vast and so rich and have so much to offer to readers around the world, why can't it be read on its own terms? And why are our translators and our editors and our copy editors and our publishers so frightened of allowing a new flavor of English to come through? This is an important question, and I think the answer to this might come if we start thinking in terms of how to shift the locus of the publishing of translations away from the physical territories of the Western world. English is a world language. English is read by people all over. Is there any particular need that all the publishing has to take place only in the UK and in the US? Particularly in this day and age when technology allows you actually not to be located physically anywhere at all. I know of at least two or three publishers of presses based in the UK who have not lived in the UK for the past year or more. What difference does it make? This is where I want to talk actually about the amazing work that the independent presses in the UK are doing, because they are our role models. If you make a pitch for a translation to a publisher in India or in the UK or in the US, however much they may talk to, and I'm talking about the big multinational commercially oriented publishers, however much they may pay lip service to the quality of the work, the fact is that the most important question that they will use, the most important criterion that they will use to decide is going to be whether the book will sell or not. There's nothing wrong with a book selling. The point is that in today's day, when so much of sales is data driven, when you get to know so much about what kind of book is selling and what the magic ingredients are of books that sell, you will end up producing more of the same. You will end up repeating the formula because the data is giving you such clear answers. And that automatically means that you will start ruling out the possibility of new works, new voices, new languages coming in through English, through experimental works, and so on. Now, this is where the independent presses come in. And they have come in fearlessly. They have come in without consideration for whether they're going to get bestsellers or not. And they have come in, and I dare say they have changed the landscape of reading in the English language in the UK over the past 5 or 6 years in the most fantastic way. So much so that I suspect that for many readers, it is no longer axiomatic that a book that they're reading in the English language was necessarily written in English to begin with. Think about it. How fantastic would it be if you picked up a book in a language that you knew, but it turned out that it was not originally written in that language at all, that it comes to you from another language? Suddenly, at one stroke, you as a reader have your windows opened in all directions. And I would imagine that for publishers to be able to achieve this would be a most remarkable thing, would be the thing that they would be dying to do. And yet, big money publishing does not do anything of this kind. Big money publishing plays it safe. Big money publishing goes for those same writers whose works have done well in translated versions in the past, and they want more of them. They want 5 book deals with a writer so that they can tie up their next 5 translated works, which is great. great news for translators, of course, for those individual translators. But you see where I'm getting at. The windows are not really opening wide in all directions. They're very focused. The directions are being handpicked, and this is what gatekeeping is all about. So, for a translator, the translator has this great opportunity, which a writer writing in their own language does not, of bringing a huge diversity of work from different languages into English. And what it has done in India over the past few years, and this is very, very interesting, is that it has gradually started pushing original Indian writing in English, the thing that used to be known by the abbreviation IWE. It has started pushing it into a smaller corner, because now you have books in English which were first written in Tamil, in Telugu, in Kannada, in Bangla, in Malayalam, in Assamese. And these, of necessity, are about things, are from a world, are from a system of aesthetics and beliefs and reality that are necessarily very different from those covered by books that are written originally in the English language. Because as I explained, the English language is, while it has great currency, it is also only used by a very small proportion, well, a fairly small proportion of the Indian population, maybe about 300 million people out of 1.3 billion, which is a huge number. It's as big as the population of the United States and 4 times that of the UK or France. But by Indian standards, it's a very small proportion. And people who write their books in English, or choose to write their books in English, also belong to a rarefied kind of world where they live and write in English. And you can imagine that that does not represent the enormous social, cultural, economic, and I might say caste, class, and religious strata that the country of India offers if you were to be living here, and automatically serves up as material for its literature. So these translations into English, which are now published by many, many presses, including the big presses, though in far fewer numbers than before, because as I said, will they sell well? But these books are in terms of literary value are moving out from the fringes into the center. And naturally, what was at the center is in the process getting pushed into a corner. And this brings me to the point of acknowledgement of translations as a genre. Again, I keep having to go back to the UK, but it is the same in India, frankly, which is that if you look at, I will use literary awards as a surrogate for this acknowledgement. I'm not saying it is the only way, but it is a prominent way, and it can be considered a measure of how well or how important your work is considered, how well it's been received. If you look at the UK, you will see an enormous number of literary prizes across genres, across types of book, across the genders of writers, across their geographical origins, across the fact, whether they're their first book or the second book or the third book, what their theme is, what their subject is, where they're set. But almost all of them are for books written in English to begin with. How many prizes are there for translated books, even in the UK? How many prizes are there for translated books in India compared to books written in English? The main literary prizes in India, the 2 or 3 really big ones, consider translated books and English language books on an equal footing, which is great if it was a level playing field to begin with. It will be a long time before it is. But I would argue that if anything, in today's world when diversity is so important, that translated literature holds a place of greater importance, especially in countries like India, which are so diversified in themselves. They hold a place of greater importance than of literature written only in the English language, which, however, is still considered the most important slice of fiction, for example. If we just take fiction as an example, yes. So I would say that a really good translation is a far more difficult act to pull off than a really good book written in one language. You know why? Because it has to be written very, very well, at least twice over. When it was written in the language and it was first written, it has to be a damn good book. And when it is translated after that, it still has to be a damn good book, which means the translator has to write a fantastic book as well. There are many cases where excellent books have been turned to complete rubbish by translators who've not done their job well enough, right? So a book that has been written twice over and written brilliantly twice over surely deserves more awards than a book that's been written just once. This may sound facetious, but if you really think about it, it is a measure of the kind of literary activity that goes into the creation of a translated book. And if you look at these activities and you look at the kind of attention and you look at the kind of um, close observation and reading and care about detail that goes into producing a translation, producing a translated book, you realize how much more worthy it is, perhaps, of being acknowledged as the purveyor of the best literature in the world. Awards actually are important only up to a point. What is important, perhaps, is an environment, a literary environment, an ecosystem, for the lack of a better word, that enables these literatures in translation to reach readers with the same ease that books written in the primary language of that country does. And who's going to make this possible? Everybody who's part of this business. It can't be just writers, it can't be just translators, it can't be just literary agents, it can't be just editors and publishers, it can't be just booksellers. It's got to be all of these people and everybody else. It requires a cultural shift. And I am very hopeful that this cultural shift can come if reading translated literatures becomes a worldwide phenomenon, translated literatures produced at home. It does not have to be imported from elsewhere. When you have all these languages right next to you, and that, I'm talking about India specifically, then there is no reason that reading translated literatures should not be as important, or perhaps the single most important thing in a country like India, where English is accessible across the land, and it makes the literatures of different regions accessible as well. And this is a quick opportunity to inform all of you in the UK or elsewhere in the world who are working from languages like Punjabi and Urdu. I mentioned this specifically because I know that these are the languages in which the workshops will be conducted during this event. Please bring your translations to India, pitch them to publishers in India, let them be published and read in India. That's very, very important. You are, after all, translating literatures that have some kind of relationship with India or with the landmass of India. It is very essential that these get read over here and that these are sent across to as wide a readership as possible. A colleague of mine at Ashoka University, where I teach courses in creative writing, and we are the only university in India to be teaching formal courses in translation practice, not just theory, but actual practice. A colleague of mine named Rita Kothari, who herself is both a theorist of translation as well as a practitioner, she says India is a work in translation. And she's so right. Here, there is no one language in which anybody can live their entire lives anymore. We are necessarily now forced to live our lives, or I wouldn't say forced because that's coercion. I think it's a great thing that we live our lives in so many different languages, even if the words we are using are in only one or two languages. Because we, in multicultural societies, and this is something that all of you who are in the UK will be familiar with by now, even if you're speaking to someone in English, you're speaking with someone who comes from a whole different cultural system. And even if the words you're exchanging are in English, you are learning and exchanging so much more about each one another's worlds. And this is the big thing in India. We are constantly learning about one another's worlds, and we are learning not to interpret somebody else's world on our own terms, but in theirs. We are learning to see their world through their eyes, through their language. And that to me is what translation is about. When I translate a book from Bengali into English, I do not really want to make the reader feel that this is a familiar world. Oh, this language is exactly the language that I know. These expressions are precisely the expressions that I'm familiar with. This, therefore, must be a world that I am aware of. No, I want them to realize that they are reading about a world far removed from theirs in many senses, in every sense. I want them to be struck, to to be aware of the fact that it is different territory, and then to appreciate what they're getting out of this new world and this new territory. I don't want them to feel, at the risk of repeating myself, that this book has been written in their backyard. I was once taken to task by an English lady who read in one of my translations. I said that, in the searing heat of May, the asphalt had melted on the road in the searing heat of May. And she wrote to me and said, "What do you mean?" I was young then, so she was quite right when she said, "What do you mean, young man, by the searing heat of May? It is not hot in May." So you understand what I'm getting at. This is something that, in a way, you could say is the success of the translation. I'm not talking about my translation in particular, but of any translation that makes the reader feel so much at home that they forget that it is set in a different world. You could say it's a sort of superficial success of the translation. But in reality, is it really a measure of fidelity? Does it really take the world in which it was created across to the reader? Or does it only enable the reader to view this new world in terms that they themselves are familiar with? To me, these are the things that we translators need to be anxious about. And in a sense, being anxious about this automatically will cancel out the other kind of anxiety. I don't think we need to worry about whether the English we are writing or the expressions we're using or the phrases we are employing are familiar, sit comfortably, roll off the tongue of our readers. No. What matters is that we are actually able to convey the foreignness, that we are able to convey what is familiar, but also convey adequately what is unfamiliar, and to do it in a way that makes the reader ask for more. I'm going to stop here. Otherwise, one could go on and on about this, but I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Arunava. That was a really incredible talk. And I've also noticed in the chat on YouTube, people are generally just quoting you and lots of the things you said, as well as asking questions. So yeah, that's an incredibly good sign in terms of people have been enjoying themselves. So I'm going to take a few questions. Can you still hear me? You still with me?
Yeah.
Arunava, yeah, okay, perfect. So we'll jump straight in. So we had a question actually, which you've just covered, I think, in the last 5 minutes or so, in terms of the choices that you're making in terms of like throughout the translation, especially when it comes to the language used. And Anton He, who is, I think he is a South Korean translator.
Yes.
Yes, that we all know, he was talking about one of the translations, and he noted that he'd left some words in. So instead of substituting with wife or mother, you just kept some of the original language. And he was just kind of congratulating you on how it worked. But he was asking about why and how did you choose to do that, and also what your editor said, how that was kind of received by the publisher, those decisions.
Well, the editor was very happy, and the editor was in the UK, so I'm glad to have passed that test. I don't think there's a particular formula that you can apply to say these words will be translated and these not. I go by instinct. Sometimes I feel that this word will convey its meaning eventually. It will yield its meaning, even if I don't use an English equivalent. But in some way, using the English word in this sentence, particularly if it's in dialogue, seems to me very off. It seems to break the tone. It just doesn't seem right. Now, this could be because I live in India. But as I said, I might as well be true to my own ear, because I can only guess what someone else's ear is like.
Absolutely. So we've got another question actually about the kind of the experience and the relationship that you have with publishers as well, and your editors, and whether you've kind of found that it differs if you're working with a smaller independent house or a large publishing house. Yeah, do you feel more involved in the project if it's for an independent publisher? It was so lovely to hear you speak so fondly about us trying to change the literary landscape. But
Yes.
Is it the difference, or is it just it's much of the same for you?
Yes. No, well, once a book goes into editing, really, it's pretty much the same. It depends on the editor rather than on whether they belong to a large publishing house or a small one. But getting through that gate is a different story altogether, because I can see that completely different criteria are being applied. And the funniest thing is to hear an editor say, and maybe they're being polite or not, but if they're being honest, then they say there's a great book, but we can't publish it. What does that even mean? I don't get that at all. I mean, and then they say we can't publish it because our salespeople say we will not be able to sell it. So to me, publishing is broken if that is where you are. If you're saying that you cannot publish good books anymore, well, then you're in a different business.
Yeah. What's the process? Was there a book for you that kind of, obviously that's what lots of people are interested that watching, kind of how you actually get the books that you want to translate in front of publishers. Was there something for you was there a big break for you just in terms of, did one translation lead to further commissions, or kind of what advice would you give people trying to kind of
Yeah, well, I was lucky, to be honest, to start at a time in India when English language publishing was just beginning to take off and new companies were coming in, and they were all looking for more books than writers writing in English could produce. So they figured that it's a good idea to dip into this vast pool of books in the other languages. And so initially it wasn't difficult because there were already all these well-established authors who had sold hundreds of thousands of copies of their books over the past 50 or 60 or 100 years. And in a sense, because there was this vast pool and you could translate as many as you could and get published, it gave you a little bit of you were accepted more easily when you went up with a new idea. But over the years, I found myself moving away from the equivalent of the great white writer in India, and we have their equivalents, and trying to move more into looking at books that are written from the fringes and the margins. So that is a different kind of thing now, because while there are many publishers who feel that they have marketing potential in marketing writers from the fringes, because they're much more colorful characters and their stories can be told about. I mean, Indian writers in English really don't have great stories to tell of their own lives or anything. Whereas here you have people who've been in jail and who've been threatened with murder, with death, and so on. But that also is a commercial ploy. They're not looking at it from the point of view of genuine quality. So I don't expect that to last very long either. I don't know what the next trend or fad will be. Yeah, you have to keep watching out for books, I think, that you love. And it's not enough to say there's a good book. It has to be a book that you say, I absolutely love this book. And then I think everything falls into place after that. But that to me is the single most important
thing. Yeah, absolutely. Have you found that it's different process in terms of, where you've worked with lots of UK publishers as well? Has that been kind of a more difficult process for you personally?
In the UK yeah, it's certainly more difficult. There are very many more no's, but that's understandable because, an indie publisher in the UK, or for that matter, bigger publishers, also dealing with submissions from languages, translated literatures from all over the world. So, and they have a limited capacity. So I understand that, yes. And also you don't have the kind of access that you do if you were in that country. Right. And there's also a system of agenting that works well in the UK. And I don't have an agent. I haven't been able to get around to that part of I don't know how many translators do actually. I don't think Danny does, but then Danny doesn't need an agent.
We've got quite a few more questions actually, so I'll try and zoom through some more. Someone asked, what can we do to rebel against the pressure to create sanitized translations in order to increase Anglophone accessibility? So quite a big question.
Well, look, just translate the way you want to and publish them online, publish them in all the literary journals that are far more interested in diversity and the kind of courage in translations than bigger publishers might be. So go get published there, you'll get visible, and then you'll get noticed. And then before you know it, someone will come to you and say, why don't you translate this book for us? It's a great time to be a translator because you can publish fragments, you can publish a chapter, you can publish stories, poems. You can publish on your own social media feed as long as you have permission. And I think there's never been a better time to be noticed.
That's a great question. Great answer even, because I think that's what translators are told to do all the time, just kind of like, how do you get more visible in terms of, and just like you said, there's lots more tools available to us in order to kind of achieve that. Lots of people seem to like when you mentioned about when you're translating, for example, into German, don't let your Hindi become German, but let your German become more Hindi. And Naomi was asking, can you give a few examples of how you could let your English become more Bangla or take on the characteristics of another language?
Well, Yeah, I mean, you can do it most of all, I think, in dialogue, because that is when very clearly different language is being utilized and being reported and being written. So you can use a strange combination of words. You can play around with the rules of grammar. You can throw in a lot more words from the original language, as long as you're sure that they'll yield their meaning somewhere. You don't, maybe not immediately. So you can very clearly, using means both mechanical and subtle, make it very clear that this line was not spoken or written in English.
Yeah, there was actually another question as well about kind of if there's from Bridget, if there's anything you can tell us about the influence of Bangla and Hindi on the English language itself. So the other go.
Well, a bad joke, to be honest. which no, perhaps maybe not, some other time. But I am I don't know about the influence per se, but I imagine that hearing the English language spoken by native speakers of Bangla year after year after year after year might do things to your ear. So I feel that maybe British diplomats who live in Bengali speaking parts of the world will have answers to that. And I have heard people in India, those who use other languages, adopt a lot of Bengali terms for. I mean, maybe they adopt terms from all languages, but the Bengali ones stick out for me because I recognize them instantly. So one of the things, for example, they often say is "Thikache to" instead of "all right" or "okay." So you do get these things, yeah. But there are all these books that always come out of untranslatable words, and inevitably all of them are called lost in translation. But I think I must create one like that for Bangla and for the other languages from India as well.
Absolutely. So we've got a more general question about what advice you could give to beginner translators working translating literature from their country to be read abroad in English instead of the other more common way around. So any advice for aspiring translators?
Yeah, well, I mean, the most important thing to be a translator is to translate, and translate a lot, and translate every day, and inhabit the text that you're translating. And don't be in a hurry to publish, but get your getting to a point where you feel that the translated text that you're reading is the text that you read in the first version in the language that you're translating from. And when I say that, I don't just mean the accuracy of meaning, because that is perhaps the easiest thing to achieve with a good dictionary, and despite all the bad press it gets, Google Translate. Although Google Translate the other day translated, so there's a Bengali word called googly, which is not the English googly of cricket, which actually refers to a kind of crustacean, which very poor people catch in creeks and canals and eat them. And when I, out of curiosity, wanted to see what Google had to say about googly in English, it said Google. Google thinks googly is Google. So yeah, they don't always get it right, but jokes apart, accuracy is the easiest thing. What you will really be reading for is the music, the rhythms, the sounds, the silences, and the effect. This is the only word I like that academics use, effect, which is the overall impact, both cerebral and emotional, that text that a book has on you. And are you feeling the same things? Are you getting all the same feels, as they say nowadays, when you're reading your translation? And when you are, then you know that you've got there, and now you can go out and start showing your work. And believe me, for all that I said, if you have a great translation, it will be published.
So you personally, how do you know when a translation is ready then? Do you kind of, before approaching publishers, will you use your other networks of the readers or the people within your community that kind of help?
Yeah, and well, no, I don't. I'm very scared of asking anybody, because I'm terrified. And I might just want to say, this is it, I'm not translating ever again. I'm not taking that risk. But also, it's tough because you have deadlines. It's not, I mean, I would ideally like to finish a draft, let it cook for a month or two, and then go back to it and work on it again. But it's very tough when you have deadlines. But I try nevertheless. That's why I sometimes work on two books at a time, so that I'll work on one, let it cook while I work on the other, go back to the first one. And also, when my memory of translating it has faded a bit, so that I can go back to the original text without the intervening layer of all the problems that I was solving while translating it. And then you don't have to read the whole thing, but you immediately get a sense of whether you've got there or not. And it has happened a couple of times that I've actually said, no, this is not working. I have to go back and rework this, which is very difficult, by the way. Completely reworking something you've done is very difficult, but sometimes it has to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of a bit of an insight into the life of the daily life of you as a translator as well, because I think obviously, well, we know quite a lot of the same people, and everyone knows how busy you are. Just even the fact we had to update your bio with an additional 10 books that you've been working on quite recently.
Yeah,
So
but all translators will tell you that they work at exactly the same pace.
Yeah.
No translator works slowly. No, there is not one translator who works slowly.
Yeah. In terms of just kind of like how you balance your time, kind of what do you have work outside of being a translator as well, or are you able to earn an income solely from the work that you're doing in translation?
No, I have a full-time teaching job at Ashoka University in Delhi, just on the outskirts of Delhi, where I teach creative writing, including translation courses. And I also work as consulting editor for the book section of an Indian website called scroll.in.
Brilliant. Yeah, because I think that's one of the things that translators often ask as well. Like, is this, do I need to focus all of my time and energy into this? Or is there things I can be doing outside of it to keep myself, to sustain myself really, and kind of grow those networks?
Not every translator in the world will be able to earn a living solely from translation, but some might be able to. And you should at least try to be one of them till you absolutely know that you can't.
Got a question from Danny, actually. He says hello.
Hi, Danny.
Can you say something about the status of translations in India from languages that are not Indian languages? I'm conscious we always seem to talk about translation in India as if it's only within national languages.
Yes, it's a very, very small subsection of the publishing scene. And it works mainly on the basis of grants given by the governments or cultural organizations from the countries whose literatures they pay to have translated into one or more of the Indian languages. But the big problem there is finding people who know both languages well enough. And there's a big debate going on now on whether to adopt English as a bridge language or not. I think the grants are not very well disposed towards the use of English as a bridge language, but in practical terms, it seems that it could be the better way to allow more translations to be produced and published. The other way around is to use, and this is something I've advocated a lot, which is to use people in combination, pairs. So not everybody may have great Portuguese and great Hindi, but there'll be someone who will have great Portuguese and a smattering of Hindi, and someone who has very good Hindi and maybe can get to learn a bit of Portuguese, and they can work together and maybe not use a bridge English text at all, although I imagine their conversations will be in English. But I've heard a great story about a translation like this, where the author and the translator who did not share a language, the author practically enacted everything for the translator. They were sharing a room, right down to the point where there was this one scene where the protagonist had to slide down a wall with his back scraping against it. And so he just demonstrated. And I was thinking how much easier it would be if the writer could just act it all out. Who needs to read the text even?
Absolutely. But let's maybe not... this is not something that aspiring translators should expect, that you'd have to act out.
Yeah, no, don't get your hopes up.
But we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I think we've managed to go through the majority of the questions. So yeah, I suppose it's just a case of if you've got any closing remarks or encouragement for people trying to get into translation, if there's anything else you'd like to share with us before we sign off.
Well, I would just say translate a lot. Please don't get discouraged by what is happening at the other end, which is the publishing end. That will come your way. But the very act of translating itself is important. Once you know that the text now has a life in another language, there are many ways in which it can get out. For example, all these audiobook sites, Storytel and Audible, they're all desperately looking for material to produce audiobooks out of. So you don't even always have to go the conventional route of being published in print first. There are plenty of these over-the-top streaming platforms that are looking for material, and you could very easily submit your story to one of them. So there are many ways today for your translations to be read. So do not get discouraged by the narrower roads of big publishing. Please translate all the time.
Thank you, Arunava. I feel it was at one point I wrote a note down saying that you wanted a crown from a publisher. You don't expect a crown, but I feel like
Yeah,
absolutely deserved one
that's true.
today. And are there, just to close off, are there any books that you're currently working on that you are incredibly passionate about and would like to share with us, or share with all of our viewers?
Well, I've just turned in the translation of book of the second novel that I've translated by a writer who comes from the caste that used to be called Untouchables earlier. And he writes this book about a young boy, an 18-year-old boy who went into prison in his mother's arms because she had killed his father. And she died 2 years later, and he had to stay in jail till he was 18 because nobody would take him out. And he was only allowed out when he became an adult. And now he goes out into the big wide world, and what he does there, and his first encounter. Imagine your first encounter of the world at the age of 18. And of course, it's a sort of he becomes part of a society that lives very much invisibly for the upper middle class and the middle class. So it's like everything this guy writes. It's a fascinating sort of semi-ethnographic, semi-romantic work.
Brilliant. It sounds fascinating. So that's the end of the discussion. So lots of people are thanking you in the chat. So I'll pass them on to you. And then also, so the next event that we'll have as part of the conference is how the publisher will work with you. So again, details are on our website, but you can sign up to the session, and it will be with myself, Sophie Hughes, Nicholas Morley and Paul Engels. So there'll be mixtures of publishers and translators there. So get your questions ready in advance. But thank you everyone for joining us. So yeah, we'll leave it there.